coming. We're very happy to welcome Professor Elizabeth Enriquez, Betsy, to her students from the Philippines who are here doing postgrad. No? But Professor Enriquez has a book, we went through the SOAS library, and it's probably the only comprehensive book on Philippine radio, the history of Philippine radio. So this is in the SOAS library, and I think we'll maybe have a second copy. And so, yeah, it's really interesting, but she has a specific angle to the history, you know, so it's colonial broadcasting. So I know Professor Enriquez because she's associate partner with us with Decolonizing Southeast Asian Sound Archives. It's an HRC project that we are doing, and Professor Enriquez is one of our partners. So we have invited, and she has kindly said yes to come. So if you don't know, Professor Enriquez is Professor Emeritus, no? At the College of Mass Communication at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. So, and she is the author of this book. So without much ado, and then so we can have more time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming here. When you say Professor Emeritus, that means old. I've already reached that point. Okay, thanks a lot. I've been doing research on the history of broadcasting in the Philippines for a number of years. But for tonight's presentation, Christina and I decided that I'm going to focus on this period, the Second World War, because this is the period when a lot of Filipinos listen to the BBC, and I'm sure that is something that is interesting to you folks. No, actually, not just the BBC, but also the Voice of America. Okay, so I'm old-fashioned. I still have paper. I'm more comfortable reading from paper. Okay, so I'm going to begin. Stories about the use of radio broadcasting for propaganda and intelligence gathering in both the First and Second World Wars are rather well known, as there are numerous historical accounts that document the role radio played in both wars. While in its experimental stage of development as a medium of mass communication, radio was used by both the United States and Europe for coded military communication in World War I. Before World War II began in 1939, the technology of shortwave radio had already made possible the transmission of broadcast signals across continents. This made it an indispensable tool in the propaganda machinery of both the Allies and the Axis powers in fighting a global war. The Nazis acknowledged that the German Revolution would not have been possible without the state-controlled radio and the airplane. On the other hand, while American commercial radio had been on shortwave since the 1930s, the American government joined the shortwave battle only in 1941, a few months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th, which was December 7, actually, December 8 in the Philippines. When the US finally brought shortwave radio into its arsenal of war weapons, it took over several stations throughout the country for the duration of the war. Radio broadcasting, as well as other media, has since been a mainstay in propaganda programs around the world, whether in war or in peace, but more overtly in war or situations of conflict, as we can see that's happening again today. Molding public opinion and mobilizing public responses in support of or in opposition to hostile parties. A historical study of how radio broadcasting was first used as propaganda tool in war may reveal some of the tactics that were employed then and even today. In this presentation, I will focus on how radio was employed in the Philippines during the Second World War, by the invading Japanese, the Filipino-American resistance, and most of all, the Filipino public. I will implicate the role of the BBC and the Voice of America in describing how Filipinos waited out the war. I will begin this narrative with the invasion of the Philippines by the Japanese at the end of 1941. Within hours of bombing Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, which is December 8 in the Philippines, December 7 in Hawaii, Japan began its attack on the Philippines. Filipinos were awakened by the news on radio that the Japanese had bombed Hawaii. On station KZRH, an American announcer calmly read the news. 10 hours later, he rushed to the military base Clark Airfield in Pampanga, north of the capital, Manila, to describe, for the benefit of radio listeners, the damage wrought by Japanese bombers who, minutes ago, flew by to drop a devastating bomb. All radio stations quickly canceled entertainment programs or expanded schedules of newscasts. American broadcasters on Philippine Radio were sending radio reports on the attack in the Philippines to radio stations in the United States via shortwave. Within a few days, U.S. High Commissioner Francis B. Sayre appointed station KZRH manager Bert Silen as chief coordinator of information in relation to the war effort. On December 15, Silen appointed 3 members of his station KCRH staff as his assistants: Program Director Johnny Harris, announcer Ramon Escudero, and technician Simeon Cheng. Simeon Cheng was a Chinese national who studied radio engineering at the Philippine School of Arts and Trade before working for KCRH. Their job was to air favorable news for the Allies and create anti-Japanese propaganda. As the Japanese aggressively advanced towards Manila, the United States Army forces in the Far East, or the USAPE, withdrew from Manila and regrouped in Bataan, the province of Bataan, northwest of Manila, and the island of Corregidor, which is off Manila Bay, close to the West Philippine Sea. Before leaving the capital on the last few days of 1941, the USAPE blew up the radio broadcast equipment of the 5 radio stations in Manila on order of General Douglas MacArthur to keep them out of Japanese hands. All large transmitters were blown up, portable transmitters were commandeered, and records and other papers in the studios were destroyed. However, at KZRH, before the USAPE blew up the transmitters, Cheng pulled out and brought to Corregidor a shortwave transmitter and other radio parts and equipment upon instruction from Silen. In Corregidor, Cheng, working with military radio engineers under KZRH announcer and chief engineer Ted Inns, installed the transmitter and other radio equipment to erect a makeshift radio station, which MacArthur christened the Voice of Freedom. On January 5, 1942, the Voice of Freedom went on the air from an improvised studio inside the Malinta Tunnel in Corregidor. The dramatic broadcast aired nightly at 6 o'clock. The program opened with the American anthem Star Spangled Banner, followed by a voice that identified itself as the Voice of Freedom. That voice was the voice of newspaperman Carlos P. Romulo, who became a Philippine Army Reserve Major. He was also the general manager of a company that operated 2 radio stations in Manila. Without identifying himself on the air, Romulo gave updates about the effort to stall the southward thrust of the Japanese forces into Bataan. The Japanese were coming from the north. His program was followed by another voice that identified itself as the Tinig ng Kalayaan, Tagalog for Voice of Freedom. It was the voice of Philippine Army Lieutenant Francisco Isidoro, who translated and delivered the news in the Tagalog language. Quezon requested Isidoro's services. Quezon wanted a Tagalog speaker on the Voice of Freedom, and Isidoro fitted the bill. To avoid detection, the broadcast aired on different frequencies, which the listeners followed on the dial. At one point, the Japanese managed to jam the station's frequency with a more powerful signal. So Cheng went back to Manila to secure radio parts that he smuggled back into Corregidor to enable the Voice of Freedom to resume broadcast. All radio stations quickly canceled entertainment programs to make way for expanded schedules of newscasts. American broadcasters on Philippine Radio were sending radio reports on the attack in the Philippines to radio stations. Oops, I think I read that already. Okay. For over 4 months, From early January to early May 1942, the Voice of Freedom fought a propaganda duel with a Japanese-controlled Manila station, which they built out of remnants of KZRH equipment and for which the Japanese kept the same call letters. For a time, the Voice of Freedom kept Filipino morale high by counteracting Japanese propaganda and keeping alive the hope that the Americans would rescue the Philippines. However, with the relentless advance of the Japanese towards Bataan and the failure of America to send immediate rescue, as a matter of fact, they failed dismally, the Voice of Freedom towards the end of the siege could not calm the growing hunger, fatigue, and frustration of the Filipino-American troops. By the way, Romulo was not the only announcer in English on the Voice of Freedom. The others were Leon Maria Guerrero and Norman Reyes. Romulo Guerrero and Salvador P. Lopez, who would later become a diplomat and president of the University of the Philippines, wrote the news and commentary in English, while Isidoro translated their scripts to Tagalog. Leon Maria Guerrero was at one point the ambassador of the Philippines to the Court of St. James. Just before Bataan fell, Romulo was evacuated to Australia and Reyes took over the announcing job completely. Reyes is best remembered for his dramatic broadcast on April 9, 1942, when Bataan fell to the Japanese. He read from a script written by Salvador P. Lopez, which Isidoro translated to Tagalog and then read on the air. Lopez was heartbroken. He mechanically wrote the announcement that would later be considered a classic piece of wartime journalistic writing. In the meantime, listeners in the South monitored the war in Luzon by listening to the Voice of Freedom, whose signals were relayed to KZRC, the lone commercial station outside Manila, located in the southern island of Cebu. Unlike the Manila stations, which were forced to cease broadcast as the USAPE blew up their equipment, KZRC continued broadcasting freely until the Japanese overran the province in May 1942. KZRC carried the signals of the Voice of Freedom until the Japanese took Bataan on April 9, 1942, then continued broadcasting on its own for another month before the Japanese literally burst through its door. Its station manager, American Harry Fenton, became famous in Cebu for his lengthy diatribes on the air against the Japanese. After months of siege, the Filipino-American resistance in Corridor surrendered to the Japanese army in early May 1942. The occupying forces made Major General Jonathan Wainwright, who assumed command of the resistance in Bataan and Corregidor when General Douglas MacArthur evacuated to Australia, announced the surrender on the air. At around 11:30 p.m. on May 7, 1942, Wainwright sat before a microphone and called on American and Filipino troops still fighting in the field to surrender to the Japanese. The broadcast went on until almost midnight. The announcement was heard on the Japanese-controlled KZRH. The capture of Bataan and Corregidor silenced the Voice of Freedom, but in its wake, the dramatic broadcasts of a new resistance radio filled the air. The station was called the Voice of Juan de la Cruz, which went on the air about a week after Corregidor fell. 18-year-old Carlos Malonzo was the voice that identified himself as the voice of Juan de la Cruz. He commented on the progress of the war, picking up information from the shortwave broadcast of Chungking Radio in China, the BBC, and KGEI, a shortwave station in San Francisco, California, which the US military operated and aimed at the nations on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, particularly the Philippines during the war. Historian A.V.H. Hartendorf surmises that the commentator probably served in the US Navy, where he acquired a sailor's vocabulary. Hartendorf must have meant crude and rude. Malonzo did not hesitate to use such language in expressing his opinion of the Japanese, who were making extraordinary efforts to find him. Malonzo taunted the Japanese on the air using Coarse language. When the Japanese offered a reward of 2,500 pesos for information that would lead to his capture, he retorted and offered 1 peso for every sakdal, the sakdal is an organization of supposedly pro-Japanese organization. And then he offered 5 pesos for every Filipino collaborating with the Japanese. And for that, quote, SOB, General Homa, 750. Homa was the commander of the Japanese Imperial Army in the Philippines at that time. Malonzo was not with the US Navy. He quit high school. He worked at the National Foods Warehouse in Santa Mesa, Manila, assisting delivery truck driver Jeronimo Ejanyata to be able to support his mother. At the beginning of the occupation, Malonzo witnessed a Japanese sentry slap an elderly Filipino woman who failed to bow in obeisance. Incensed, he launched his personal war against the Japanese. He gathered his friends, including Yata, and together they stole 50,000 pesos worth of goods from the Japanese supply warehouses, sold the items in the black market, and used the proceeds to procure equipment and put the Voice of Juan de la Cruz on the air. He hired radio technician Tony San Juan to assemble the radio parts and equipment, scriptwriter Oscar Arellano to write the scripts, a Japanese-speaking interpreter, another technician, I didn't get the name, and 4 others who served as lookouts and bodyguards. The signal of the Voice of Juan de la Cruz was picked up and acknowledged by the KGI. Radio broadcasting equipment being portable, the station was constantly on the move within Manila and its suburbs. Like the Voice of Freedom, it signed on with the anthems of the United States and the Philippines. He didn't have a record of the Star-Spangled Banner, so San Juan produced a blank record, and on it they recorded the anthem. The US anthem, and Malonzo sang it. Okay, so it was all very improvised. While another one of the guys was playing by the in guitar. On July 4, choosing the date of the American independence, Malonzo married Violet Brown, a Filipino American mestiza. 6 days later, the Japanese caught up with him and some members of his group and locked them up in the defense fortress, Fort Santiago. Brown was released, so she carried on the broadcast until September 1942 with some members of the group who escaped arrest. Malonzo, however, and 8 of his men were executed after 4 months of incarceration because he refused to rat on the rest of the group. In the meantime, as soon as the Japanese forces entered Manila on January 1942, the broadcast engineers among the Corps searched for radio equipment to be able to begin radio propaganda, having found the facilities of most of the pre-war radio stations useless. They salvaged an antenna at a transmitting station in a Manila suburb, which is present-day Cubao, Quezon City, where a few pieces of KZRH equipment hidden in the basement of the Hickok building on Escolta Avenue were hidden, where the station studios were located. They also found some transmitting equipment concealed at the High Allied building. I don't know if some of us remember this High Allied building on Taft Avenue, which was being set up by an underground resistance group to communicate with the group of MacArthur in Corregidor. In less than 2 weeks, on January 14, 1940, the Japanese broadcasters were also on the air from the old KZRH studio, keeping its call letters initially. KZRH and the newspaper dailies Tribune and Taliba, which the Hodobu also took over, became the principal propaganda outlets of the invaders. The Hodobu was the propaganda arm of the Japanese. The Japanese came to conquer not only the land and its resources, but also the hearts and minds of Filipinos. It had a propaganda corps, which included broadcasters. The propaganda corps was first called the Sendenhan, literally propaganda corps, in the first few months of the occupation, but it was later renamed Hodobu, the Department of Information, because it was not so obvious, name was not made so obvious that it was really a propaganda machinery, and also to avoid the negative connotation of the name Sendenhan. The call letters KZRH were replaced by PIAM almost 2 years later on October 14, 1943, when the Japanese declared sham independence for the Philippines. PIAM stood for Philippine Islands A, Manila. Relay stations were established outside the capital, the PIBC for Philippine Islands B, Cebu, the PICD for Philippine Islands C, Davao, and the PIDI for Philippine Islands B, Iloilo. These were islands in the south. The relay stations, apart from carrying PIAM programs emanating from Manila, may have also aired their own programs in the languages Cebuano and Ilonggo. Other relay stations were erected in Naga, Baguio, Zamboanga, Cotabato, and Legazpi cities. A relay station was planned for Tuguegarao City but did not push through. PIAM also aired on shortwave with the call letters PIRN, probably for Philippine Islands Radio Nippon, for the benefit of listeners outside the Philippines. Initially, the station broadcast for 5 hours daily from 7 p.m. until midnight. As programming expanded, broadcast hours increased. In May 1942, the station began to sign on at 7:55 a.m. and signed off at 11 p.m. or for 15 hours a day. A year later, in April 1943, airtime increased when the station began to sign on an hour earlier at 6:55 a.m. and sign off later at 11:15 p.m. Programming in the early months of 1942 consisted of announcements from the Japanese Military Administration, or JMA, the news in Nihongo and English, and music. In the beginning, the music played on the air was American live classical music, records of which were found at the KZRH studio. There were no recordings of Japanese music yet, and only later would live Japanese songs and music be heard on the air. As programming expanded to several more hours a day, more programs in the Filipino language called Tagalog were heard, but also in Nihongo and other Filipino languages such as Ilonggo and Cebuano. Newscasts in English, Tagalog, and Spanish of 15 minutes each were aired 3 times a day. English would have been banned on the air if not for the fact that it was the only common language between the Hodobu and the Filipinos. Eventually, the news was also regularly read in Nihongo. Documentaries on Japanese history and culture were frequently heard. Church services, lectures aimed at women and children, and literary readings in Japanese were allotted airtime, as well as Tagalog comedy skits and dramas, many written by Filipino scriptwriters Clodoaldo del Mundo and Lina Flor, as well as musical skits with music written by Filipino composer Felipe de Leon. By the way, later on would also compose the anthem of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Filipino music as well as Western classical music was played on the air. Since Japan did not have recorded music yet, Japanese songs and music were performed live with the guidance of music sheets. A Japanese pianist, Filipino pianist Jose Vicarion, and Filipino musicians and singers provided the live music. Fidela Magpayo, better known to post-war radio fans as Tia Deli, became the most popular radio singer during the period. She sang mostly Filipino songs, but she and Polish Filipina Nelly Bialoblovsky, known as Ginger, on the air, also sang Japanese songs repeatedly on the air, which their Japanese managers thought was the best way to teach the Filipinos Japanese music. Somewhat emulating the practice prior to the war, they also made personal appearances in the rural areas near Manila. By the way, I should have mentioned here that they banned jazz from the United States because they thought it was jungle airs and only for the barbarians. So that's how they described it. Okay, more Tagalog and Japanese music then replaced American music. Jazz was deemed by the Japanese as one of the symbols of the degenerate American culture. That's their description. So it was completely suppressed after some time. Actually, in another paper that I wrote, because I dug up some more data about this, they could not really put it off the air until about a year from after they came into Manila. Okay, so in May 1943, the Philippine Symphony Orchestra was formed and their performance of classical music were put on the air. As the war progressed, lessons in Nihongo as well as Filipino languages increased and more newscasts and talk programs urging people to produce food and other necessities went on the air. In the early part of 1942, the Nihongo lessons were given by a Professor Kusama. Later, other Japanese professors gave the lessons on Nihongo as a regular part of the programming, including Professor Matsukawa, Hinomizu, and Okazaki. It should be noted that lessons on the Tagalog language were also on the air, designed by Lope K. Santos, whom later would be recognized as the ama ng Balarila, or father of the Filipino grammar and Tagalog orthography. In conjunction with the lessons, a Linggo ng Nihongo, or Japanese Language Week, was celebrated every last week of August during the war, as well as a Linggo ng Pilipino, or Filipino Language Week, every last week of December. In stark contrast to radio programs before the war, incessant speeches and exhortations by Japanese officials and Japanese appointed officials of the Filipino government were aired, including those of Japanese installed President Jose P. Laurel, Quintin Paredes, who was Commissioner of Public Works and Communications, Senator Vicente Madrigal, who was one of the drafters and signatories of the Philippine Constitution during the occupation, Representative Benigno S. Aquino, also a drafter and signatory of said Constitution and Speaker of the Wartime National Assembly, as well as the Director General of the Kalivapi, the Japanese-style neighborhood association, Vice President for Foreign Affairs Emilio Abello, and Assistant Commissioner of Education, Health, and Public Welfare, Camilo Osias. By the way, Benigno S. Aquino was the father of Benigno Inoue Aquino. And some of us may remember his name as the most serious and most viable challenger to Ferdinand Marcos towards the end of martial law. A program that today would sound odd was Radio Taiso, with which the station signed on at 7:55 a.m. beginning not later than October 1942. It was a 15-minute calisthenics program, which government employees and school children were required to tune into so they could follow the exercise commands of the unseen instructor. The program was repeated at noon. Some historians link the physical exercise program to the station's objective, which is the Japanization of Filipinos, best expressed through obedience to an invisible authority, as in the way the Japanese revered their emperor, who until then was not seen in public. Winning over the Filipinos to the Japanese side through broadcasting involved not only managing program content, but also the Japanese found out by also controlling listening. Of all the propaganda outlets the Hodobu controlled, radio was managed more strictly because the Japanese regarded radio as one of the most effective propaganda devices, a weapon on which victory or defeat could hinge. In an editorial, the Japanese-controlled Tribune described radio propaganda from the enemy as sometimes deadlier than enemy bombs. As early as February 1942, the JMA realized that without the pre-war commercial stations and with only the Japanese-controlled station on the air, Filipinos turned to shortwave broadcasts from the United States, from Britain and Australia, especially to KGEI in San Francisco and the BBC in London. The Japanese then immediately banned aerials or antennas. Then they realized that most of the radios in the country were of the latest technology already that did not require external antennas to receive overseas broadcasts. So they continued to listen. Okay, so they found when they found out, they changed the strategy. So 6 months later, the Hodobu decided on another strategy to restrict radio listening. On August 13, 1942, it was announced that radio receiving sets must be registered with the Customs Office. On January 6, 1943, the JMA ordered the reconditioning, that was what it was called, of all shortwave receivers except those permitted by the Japanese Army. Reconditioning meant that sets would be converted or refit so that their shortwave tuners could receive only broadcasts made by the Japanese military or those originating from Japan. Actually also from Taiwan, because they had Taiwan controlled by this time. The measure was supposed to protect the Filipinos from harmful foreign influences. Enemy broadcasts were called bullets of voice and invisible bombs. On January 17, 1943, the wartime newspaper Tribune justified Japanese control of radio, saying that the ruling was necessary to save the Filipinos from the pernicious influence of hostile propaganda and mental sabotage via radio. The deadline to submit radio sets for reconditioning was extended to June 30, 1943, and again to October 31, 1943 for radio sets outside Manila because they realized that the Filipinos were resisting the order. Realizing the persistence of many Filipinos to listen to unauthorized shortwave broadcasts, defiance of the order became punishable by torture or death. Nevertheless, less than half of the estimated 80,000 sets, which another estimate put at 100,000, were registered. Many that were registered were restored, sometimes in better condition to receive shortwave signals, often by the Filipinos who constituted the core of technicians tasked with the reconditioning of the radio sets. Many of them hid the part and then, or sometimes put it in, in trash cans and then retrieved later, or in the gutters and retrieved later. Some of the more entrepreneurial ones sold it. Okay. Some of them surreptitiously sold expensive removable converters that owners hid at inspection. Persistent listening to forbidden radio signals was a bold and valiant act by many listeners who risked their lives by the mere possession of shortwave radio. Perhaps more significant was the growing maturity and intelligence of audiences in the face of suppression. They listened to the newscasts on the American military station KGEI, but preferred the news programs of the BBC due to what was perceived as the BBC's more factual presentation. KGEI was a shortwave station in San Francisco, California, owned by the General Electric International. It beamed its signals to Asia across the Pacific Ocean to promote the GE brand name in electric appliances and other electronic products. In September 1941, the US military took it over to air counter propaganda against the Japanese. As mentioned earlier, many Filipinos hid their radio sets and avoided registration, so that less than half of the about 100,000 sets were registered. This implies that as many as 40 to 50,000 sets may have tuned into KGEI and the BBC in the Philippines during the war, in spite of the threat of death or torture. And of course, not counting those that were reportedly secretly rigged back by Filipino technicians to re-enable shortwave receivers. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the bombing of the Philippines within hours of each other, the US government created the Office of War Information, which consolidated US government information services during the war. It took over management of KGEI and the newly organized Voice of America and established an overseas branch for propaganda campaigns abroad. This was actually later developed into what today we call the Central Intelligence Agency. Yes, that's how it started, radio monitoring. KGEI was a critical source of news from the United States. Apart from its American broadcasters, at least 9 Filipinos were in its staff, including Gregorio San Diego, Jaime V. Catuira, Eddie Ramos, Pasiano V. Sanchez, Florencio Marquez, and Marcelino Tantuaco. Their programs were intended specifically for the Filipino audience. They translated and read the news in English to Tagalog and other Filipino languages, including Ibanag, Ilocano, Pangasinan, Pampango, Bicol, Hiligaynon, Cebuano, and what was then called Moro. Tagalog phonograph recordings, as well as American music, were played on the air for the benefit of the Filipinos listening across the Pacific Ocean. Particularly popular was the program of Carmen Ligaya, who was KGEI's answer to Tokyo Rose of the Nihon Hosokyokai, or the broadcast network NHK of Japan. Tokyo Rose is another story, but I'm not going to go into that unless you ask me about it later. Guerrilla groups in the rural areas as well as individuals in the cities who had access to shortwave radio, clandestinely transcribed BBC and KGEI broadcasts for underground circulation. By transcription here, meaning listening to the news and writing it down quickly, and then making copies for distribution. That's how they've let the others know what's going on. Those who were found out by the Japanese and their Filipino agents paid with their lives or suffered torture. Inside the internment camp for prisoners of war and civilians, in spite of the impossible conditions, news about the war circulated either through radio transcripts smuggled in by visiting family and friends, or by the prisoners themselves, who were also operating clandestine receivers. Inside Malacanang Palace itself, the home of the Philippine president, was a shortwave radio receiver secretly operated by Philippine Constabulary Captain Angelo Frago, who supplied Jose P. Laurel with Allied radio dispatches from October 1943 until late 1944. Laurel was installed by the Japanese as Philippine president during the war. The secret radio set inside the presidential palace allowed him to paint a balanced picture of the war developments. Laurel discreetly recruited Frago and his men, who smuggled the radio parts piece by piece into the palace, which they assembled and operated in a photographic darkroom, suspected but never found by the Japanese. Aware of the sentiment of many Filipinos, Laurel refused to comply with the order of the Japanese military administration to address the country by radio to announce the formation of a government in exile, as he was evacuated by the Japanese Supreme War Council together with his cabinet towards the end of 1944. Elsewhere, at the Santo Tomas internment camp, or STIC in Manila, where about 4,000 civilian Americans and other foreigners were kept during the war, there were shortwave radio receivers in the camp hidden by some internees who regularly listened to KGEI, the BBC, and other overseas shortwave stations. By the way, one of the survivors of this camp was British citizen Rupert Wilkinson, who was a child at that time, who later became a historian and became Professor Emeritus of History in the University of Sussex. So she's from the University of Sussex. The camp's clandestine receivers received radio Chungking at night when it came in strong, BBC early in the morning, Radio New Delhi at midnight, and KGEI at 7 o'clock in the morning. People listened to everything their sets would receive. However, they were not uncritical listeners. Former STIC internee Myron Weiner reported after the war that KGEI was the American station best received and most listened to because of the good reception. But BBC programs were preferred for their higher quality. He said the news of the BBC was understood to be more factual, more detailed, more precise, more meaningful. Statistics were given, less bombastic and dramatic, and never overstated, with fewer adjectives and superlatives, and less dramatized, which the Americans were given to, you know. The British get emphasis by understatement, he said. Weiner was an American. He commented that the BBC sounded like it had a definite propaganda policy, while the Voice of America propaganda seemed to have no policy, and the points tried to be made were clumsy. Weiner pointed out that the Filipinos who can afford a radio did not need pro-Allied propaganda. They wanted the cold facts, with a critical commentary and analysis, which he said the BBC gave. He added Filipinos assumed that the war would end and that the Americans and the Allied forces would claim victory. But most of all, Weiner said, Filipinos wanted to know if their Japanese military pesos would be accepted to buy food and after the war. It should be noted that the Philippine peso under the Japanese was extremely depreciated and the inflation was sky high. From Australia, MacArthur launched a campaign to take the Philippines back from the Japanese. Upon landing on Palo Beach Leyte on October 20, 1944, he went on the air and announced, "This is the voice of freedom, General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. You can find that recording actually online. Thousands of concealed radio sets were tuned in. Soon after MacArthur's I Have Returned broadcast, PIAM's Filipino staff dwindled and programming hours were reduced. On December 30, 1944, PIAM ceased broadcast in Manila. The Japanese evacuated Laurel and his cabinet to Baguio City, then to Japan, while the Americans reclaimed the country in the bloody and deadly battles that followed. In 1945, Filipinos once again freely listened to the American brand of broadcasting, and listening to the BBC also became a habit for many. In 1946, on the Declaration of Philippine Independence on July 4, commercial radio broadcasting were back. Let me conclude. You can ask about some more details later. Because of the heavy-handed method by which the Japanese imposed its doctrine, there was profound resistance to Japanese-controlled radio. Filipinos listened with disdain to broadcast stations sanctioned during the period, but also monitored banned underground signals emanating from resistance groups broadcasting within and outside the country, including the BBC and the VOA. World War II was as much a contest of might as it was a battle of ideologies, and radio broadcasting was a critical answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Something I was really fascinated with is when you made a comment about how the Japanese propaganda radio appealed to Filipinos to kind of believe in a higher authority in the same way as their invisible emperor. Could you expand a little bit more, like, on what was the general message that the Japanese were giving within their propaganda to try to win support from people? Like, what was their, central argument or angle, if you can?
That the Philippines was for Asians, for the Orientals. Okay, so they really made a big issue out of us being occupied by colonized by the Americans, and that it was time that the Asians became work with each other, and in fact they had the GEAC, ano nga ba yun? I forgot. Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yeah.
So that was the idea, to say that, hey, we're Asians, we should be for each other, not for America. So but if you look at the programming, it was really also very similar to American programming, and I infer that it's because this is what the Filipinos wanted, and they were also trying to get the Filipinos to listen to Philippine radio. They just invented the call letters PIAM. PI stood for Philippine Islands.
Yeah.
Letter A, Manila, letter B, Cebu, etc. down the line. But many Filipinos said that the PIAM for them stood for something else. I'm going to say it in Filipino, but it's really bad. I don't know how to say words like that. It was supposed to be putang ina ang maniwala.
And no one's willing to translate.
Those who believe are sons of bitches. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ang maniwala.
Ang maniwala.
Oh,
Ang maniwala.
Oo. BI ang maniwala. In other words,
that's fun.
in other words, it's this is all hogwash. We all know that we are being that this is propaganda. And no one really believed them except the few that sided with the Japanese. There were a few who did support the Japanese, those who were anti-American to begin with. So there. Yeah. Maybe the other details you want to know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jovi.
It is kind of interesting that the Filipinos sided so strongly with the Americans. It's another occupier.
Yeah,
And then it's occupier against occupier.
right.
And like,
I'm gonna stand up this
and they
time.
were so strongly with the Americans. I don't know, it's just I don't know if there are instances that we see that in other countries. And was it just that they they really had, I mean, I don't know what the overall theory is or what your
Yes, in my other papers, I had a theory about that.
Yeah.
Okay, the theory, it goes this way. I believe that radio was so effective that it actually is as effective or even more so than the public school system that was instituted by the United States as soon as they came here. No? Why? Because first of all, about 90 or 95% of radio programming during that period, the American colonial period, was music. And supposedly we're very musical. We love music. We took to jazz very quickly because jazz allows a lot of improvisation. Krina here knows about jazz very well. She is a musicologist. And it did not require much effort to listen to radio. You can stay home and listen or listen to the radio set of the neighbor because listening was a community activity in many of these places because not everybody could buy radio sets at that time. To buy a radio set, a middle-level government employee at that, a bureaucrat at that time would have to shell out the equivalent of 2 months' salary. So in those days, they were selling radio sets at installment. So they were really encouraging radio listening. So what the government did, I found out from a colleague in Indonesia that when the Dutch installed radio in Indonesia, it was for the benefit of the Dutch, the colonizers. But in the Philippines, it was really for the Filipinos because they wanted Filipinos to listen. Okay, so they subsidized the radio in the beginning, bought a lot of radio sets, put them in the plazas, asked the barangay or the village chief, and also the priest to take care of some of these radio sets, put them where everybody could listen on the windows or something, full volume. See, I think that's the origin of the, up to now that practice is in full volume so that everybody could listen. So there's just not much effort and it's so enjoyable because you don't need to be literate to be able to listen to radio. While going to school required effort. It was required, and everyone was required to go to school, but still there was a lot of resistance. No, and it's difficult. You have to make time for it. You have to somehow dress, and then of course you're comparing yourself with all the others in the school. And it was, the classes were mixed from young to old. No, so that must have been uncomfortable for some, no? And it was serious. You had to learn how to read, you had to learn how to write and all that. So that was serious stuff. The listening is so enjoyable. And the Americans knew that, such that they actually said, we have to support radio because it is what will charm the Filipinos. And it did. Yeah. So
was there some American genius who figured this program out, or was it just the way they did it?
The programming was really patterned after US programming.
Yeah.
But the first Filipino, the first broadcast, well, actually the first broadcast was an experiment by somebody inside a military camp. Coincidentally, a woman. I don't know much about her, but I think she was an employee in Nichols Air Base. So, but that was a short-lived experiment, but it was broadcast. Remember that radio's mother technology was the telegraph. Okay, and the point of the telegraph was to send messages from point to point. Its weakness at that time was that others could listen in. But when radio broadcasting became the thing, that became its advantage, that people could listen in. So when a few months after Mrs. Redgrave, Henry Herman actually put up 3 experimental radio stations, one in Manila, one in Pasay, which is a city next to Manila, and one was a roving station. It's because it's a simple technology really when you think about it. So he put it in his car and just drove around because the transmitters were very weak also. So he needed people to hear. So why did Henry Herman do this? Because he had an electronic shop and he was selling radio sets from the US. Henry Herman was one of those soldiers, American soldiers, who stayed behind after the end of the Philippine American War, because the Americans encouraged some of these soldiers to stay. We'll give you $300. Help us Americanize Filipinos. You see, by staying, by doing business here, by marrying into the local population, you know, and in the case of Henry Herman, that's what he did. So, and he was with the Signal Corps, so he understood the technology. He also was part of the group that set up a lot of the telephone systems in Luzon. So he was equipped. So when this was becoming popular among Manilans, people in Manila, other stations started to come in. The next one was KZIB, and then he integrated his 3 stations, by the way, and gave it the first gave it the call letters KZ, which is the first one to have call letters in Manila. And his joke always was that actually it stood for crazy. So that's how he named his station, because they usually used, the KZ came from America. Okay, the US had I think part of W and K. West of Mississippi, it's all K. Okay, so Hawaii, which is reckoned as west of Mississippi, although I always wondered about if you went the other way, you will go around. But anyway, that's how we understood directions. So Hawaii had KZ, and because we were west of Hawaii, let's give the Philippines KZ as well. So we had KZ as our call letters in those days, which of course changed after the war, because they gave us half of the Deutschland call letters, a legacy of war. So there, that's why we have D. That's the reason why you have D today, no? That's really from Germany. I told the Germans when I was there. They didn't even know. So there, yeah. And then the other stations came in. The next one was, there was a pattern. Many of these guys who put up radio stations were in the retail business. They had department stores. Next one was Isaac Beck, who had Beck department store. And then also Erlanger and Gallinger, who had Erlanger and Gallinger department store. And then of course later on was Hickok, who had Hickok department store. The only one who's different was Yulo and Araneta, who were not in department stores, but were already in newspapers, in the newspaper business. And by the way, already where a lot of their wealth is actually from sugar. Now, these were sugar barons. And why did they, my theory is that why were they interested in radio? Because they wanted to influence public opinion, because at that point, the Philippines were talking about independence already. And then openly they were, for independence and all that, but secretly they were really afraid of this, because that would mean losing our preferential trade agreement with the United States. And we were supplying the US with a lot of sugar, and a lot of wealth in the South was built on that. So there. So radio is not so innocent. It's not just entertainment.
Questions?
Yes, Angela.
From a curiosity. So first of all, thank you. I think this is the first time I've heard of a very extensive history of radio. Oh my gosh, I need to read about it more. But I think I think the American influence on our radio today, I would say, is more apparent. But I was wondering if in your research you saw any remnants from what the Japanese brought into our radio culture or broadcast culture in general that we could still feel today, if any.
I can't think of anything. I can. One of our historians. Thank you. One of our historians, Rico Jose, said that the Japanese had a hard time in the Philippines. They had an easier time conquering the rest of Southeast Asia. It was easier. In the Philippines, it was very hard because we were already we had already, shifted our consciousness in favor of America. And that was precisely what they were fighting, but we were resisting that reorientation such that they were really more brutal in the Philippines. So many old timers who are still around remember that it was a very brutal period. My own family, my mom, she remembers her dad, my grandfather, and my uncle were nearly decapitated by the Japanese because they found out they had a radio. Yeah, my mom said they were listening to shortwave radios, but they buried the radio. So somebody ratted on them, but they didn't find the radio because they buried it, in time. Yeah, and this is not an unusual story. You can, if you read memoirs of people, you'll read about this.
Yes. And just bringing it forward, sorry, it sounds like radio was so influential at the time. And I know right now the darling of media is social media.
Yes.
But how do you feel the influence of radio? I suspect it still plays a huge influence in Philippine politics now, but what are your thoughts on it?
I don't know actually. I think we're still figuring it out, but I don't think radio will die. I don't think it'll fade away. For example, it will, well, now people are doing podcasts and all kinds of permutations of going online. In the Philippines, there is a law that requires all broadcast stations, radio and television, to go digital. Okay, we've been pushing the implementation of the law. And it's a very costly proposition because everybody has to shift to a new technology that will require networks and stations to procure expensive equipment. So there has been a push to keep delaying this. But in the meantime, many of the television stations, to a limited extent, have put on their programs a little delayed sometimes online. And many radio stations are actually streaming online. So when last year, we celebrated the 100th year of radio broadcasting in the Philippines. So I created some productions and I went to the field again and talked to some people. So I visited DZRH and talked to a lot of people there, the people in the news, and also the people in doing soap operas. Soap operas are alive. On radio. Yes, no. In the West, there are no more soaps on radio.
That's not true. They're still
in the West.
on the BBC. They play.
Sorry.
In the States, no.
Speaking of the States, yeah.
In the States, no. There's no radio dramas. Here,
Yeah.
they exist.
Oh, glad to hear that. Yeah.
They're very popular.
Yeah. And so I spoke to this group of radio artists, of radio dramatists. So I said, so how do you feel about the new technologies? And said, oh, it's good for us because, while they're doing their recordings of their dramas, it's just how many microphones, they're just standing there reading their scripts and emoting and everything. But they have a camera. They have a camera, and while they're doing their program, they're also streaming. And they said we have more fans now because they're being seen online by all the OFWs, overseas Filipinos, the Filipinos in diaspora. Could